If you're familiar with Western harmony, then you're probably familiar with something called the major scale. And the major scale, as we know, uses a simple whole half-step formula, and we can form this major scale on any of the 12 major keys in the circle of fifths. You're also probably familiar with something called triads or chords, which basically uses a simple root third fifth method. And if we take a look at the major scale, we can use this root third fifth method with every single note in the major scale, thus creating our diatonic triads. Now, each chord or triad has a certain function or a certain tonality to it. Certain chords give us a certain emotion, especially within context of a chord progression. The main group of chords that we're going to be talking about are dominant chords, and this will include the big secondary dominant chord. To keep things quick, the dominant chord is built on the fifth scale degree, creating a major triad in a major key. This is often also done in a minor key when we use the harmonic minor scale. Now, talking about Western harmony from anywhere from the Baroque all the way until the early 1900s, we sort of see a pattern of composers using the tension and resolution formula. Dominant chords, diminished chords, all of these tension chords were very typical from the common practice period all the way through the early 1900s until the atonal world kind of took over a little bit. Anyways, just keep in mind, this can also be created into seventh chords, which we'll talk about a little bit later. That's where the term dominant seven comes from. And so now that we know what a regular dominant chord is, we can understand what a secondary dominant chord is. In a brief nutshell, a secondary dominant chord is a dominant chord that is going to tonicize another chord in the scale. That might sound a little confusing, but take a look at this. If I make a 5 of 5 chord in the key of C major, it would be a D major chord. And why is that? Well, the answer is kind of in the term 5 of 5. If we know that the typical 5 chord in the key of C major is G major, then that means that a 5 of 5 would be a fifth above G, which would be, of course, D major. Obviously, the Roman numeral is capital, so it'll tell us that it is a major triad. And typically, these secondary dominant chords follow just before the actual dominant chord. In this case of a 5 of 5, we would play D major, and then we would resolve that to G major, and then the G major can be resolved back to C if you would like to return to your home key. And 5 of 5s are just really the beginning. We can do things like a 5 of 3 or a B major chord and resolve that to the E minor chord. We can do a 5 of 6, which would be an E major chord, and we can resolve that to the A minor chord. The same ordeal can work for minor keys as well, and it's going to be especially very fun when you start doing things like modulation. In a nutshell, modulation is when a composer changes from one home key to another, and oftentimes these secondary dominant chords can be a really, really good way of modulating. If we were in the key of A minor and we played a 5 of 4 chord, we'd actually play an A major chord, and that creates a lot of tension to resolve it to D minor. And that might be a good place to stay in D minor for a little while or for the rest of the song. Or maybe just go back to A minor. It's all up to the composer. Secondary dominant chords have been around for a very long time. Guys like Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, all the big guys always use secondary dominant chords to create some sort of extra tension that we kind of typically didn't get from just using a typical dominant chord. And I highly encourage you to try this for things like sweep picking, for things like arpeggios, for things like composing. It's all really good, and it's a really, really good way of starting to add more spice into your composing outside of the standard diatonic chords. Some keys are going to be a little bit harder to modulate to than others. Obviously, something like C major to G major is very close by because there's only a one key signature difference of F sharp. But again, this is just a very brief introduction to it, so I hope this helps, and I will see you guys in the next video.